Hello and welcome. My name is Tom. This is the Enthusiasm Project Season 9, Episode 2. And what it do? We're going to do some cool things today, some fun stuff today, going off of what I talked about last week, where I want there to be a very clear, hopefully purposeful takeaway from every episode. And that's what we're diving into today, talking all about editing, mainly how to edit video. A little bit of that does apply to editing audio for podcasts. And then I also have some questions too that do touch on podcast editing specifically. Part of me was even wondering, maybe podcast editing could be its own separate episode. So that's what we're going to be talking about today for the bulk of the show. Probably a little bit of a longer-ish episode, which I'm fine with, if you're fine with. We're going to start with the points I wanted to make about editing, and then we're going to kind of move into some questions I got. I asked for questions on Instagram and then also from channel supporters, and I got more than I bargained for. And that kind of shows me that people are I don't want to say struggling with editing, have questions about editing more so than I realized, and maybe in ways that are sort of difficult to navigate. Like, it's almost like you sort of feel dumb asking the question because I should already know this or everybody else already knows this, but it's absolutely not true. There's so much to learn and you don't know what you don't know. And, a lot of people, everybody plays to their strengths. You don't see what somebody doesn't know or what they're struggling with. And so even somebody who looks like they know what they're doing really well might have some of the simple questions or what seems like a simple question as well. So that's what we're going to kind of go through today. Equipment-wise, before we dive into that, I am still using the Lewitt LCT 240 Pro because I just really like how it sounds. I would love to know how you think that it sounds now that I've used it a few times, but I switched my setup a little bit between last week and this week. I put the Lewitt back on the PSA-1 boom arm, kind of coming from the side, and I rigged up this wild, I think, how many adapters? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I think I'm using a total of 8 different adapters to be able to position the Lewitt at an angle that works for me. And it's all right. I would say I'm like 85% happy with this. So yeah, we'll see. But we'll be jumping on to probably another mic next week just for funsies. But I really love the Lewitt, and it's just running through what is it running through? The generic condenser setting. No, the NT1 setting on the Rodecaster Pro. I'm trying the NT1 preset on the Rodecaster Pro II, which I'm also using the 1.1.1 firmware, the new official firmware that came out recently. I've been using all the betas, but this is the first time I'm using the official version. So it's a little risky to use new firmware on a thing that other people are going to hear and that you kind of want to work well, but it's the official firmware. So let's just see how it goes. Let's jump into editing. Let's talk about editing. I did do an episode last season that was all about like editing applications and mainly focusing on Premiere, Resolve, and Final Cut Pro. And if you want to know like kind of which application to maybe get started with or the pros and cons of each, I would definitely recommend going back and listening to that episode. Today, though, I'm trying to be more application agnostic and talk about more techniques and the ideas of how to learn to edit. We'll talk a little bit about specific applications, but mostly the question of where do you even get started when you want to learn to edit or to get better at editing? And it's pretty crazy how important and how common video editing is now. Even when I started teaching digital media, I officially started teaching digital media in 2012, even though I taught it for like a couple classes here or there prior to that. At that point, students who would come into my program in 9th or 10th grade, most of them had never edited any kind of video before. And so when we would dive into Final Cut, that was their first time editing video, which is why I do love Final Cut, because I've seen people with no experience jump into it, connect with it, and really be able to use it pretty proficiently, pretty quickly. But today I think it's totally different. I mean, it's like everybody has edited video in some way, even if it's just through an app. Like, you want to post TikTok or something. I'm assuming, I've never used TikTok. You have to edit it in the app and put it together. It's basic video editing right there. There's all kinds of online-based applications, mobile applications. Even my mom, who I gifted a GoPro to a few months back, has been playing around with like the GoPro editor and even iMovie a little bit. So the opportunities and even sometimes the necessity to edit video is a lot more common than it used to be even just a few years ago. And so there are more and more people wondering, how the heck do I edit video? Where do I even begin? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And as I was thinking about how to approach this, I realized that, in my opinion, I guess there's my disclaimer. This is all my opinion based on my experience, not scientific fact. So cherry pick what is relevant to you. But what I realized, I think, is that there are two sides to editing. So when you want to learn how to edit, it's almost like a yin and a yang. There's the technical side, which is, how do you position a clip in a certain way? What is a J cut? That kind of thing. And then there's what I'm calling, I don't know a better name for it, the philosophical side, which would be like the thought process behind the editing and the purpose of the edit, which I do think is very often overlooked and maybe something that people don't realize they're developing while they're editing. If you've edited for a long time, you've no doubt developed this philosophical side, but you probably don't realize it because it's not as concrete or as obvious as the skill set, the technical side. So I broke my points down into two parts. Part 1 is going to be the technical side. Part 2 is the philosophical side. And then part 3 will just be questions, which most of the questions do fall into the technical side of things. That's what we are going to talk about. So let's dive into part 1, the technical side of editing. Biggest question people have: where do I even begin? I want to start editing video. I want to jump into it. How do I get started? And where do I begin to learn? The answer to that, are you ready for it, is to just start editing stuff is the best way to learn in any application, whatever you have. If you're just starting editing and you're unsure if it's something you want to do a lot of or a little of or what your needs are, I definitely recommend using a free application. If you have the budget to buy Final Cut or Resolve or something, sure, go for that. But use a free application. Your phone has iMovie on it. If you have a Mac, or if you have an iPhone, it has iMovie on it. If you have a Mac, you have iMovie on it. But even Windows, I think Windows and Android devices, I think there's free applications. And if not, DaVinci Resolve. The free version is amazing. You can get that on Mac or PC and dive into a professional level editing software right there, which might be, that's definitely kind of a drinking from a fire hose situation, but it's at least an editor that will work. And then there's online-based stuff like Artlist. For example, just launched Artlist Max, which is not a commercial for, but they've been trying, instead of just royalty-free music, now through an Artlist subscription, you can get access to music, stock footage, templates, and an online video editor. So there are, and that's not the only one, there are several like online-based video editors out there. Whatever you have access to, it doesn't really matter which one it is. Just dive in and start editing. Start putting stuff together, and it's going to go so slowly at first. And that's the most frustrating part, is feeling like a beginner, because nobody likes to feel like a beginner, But as you dive in, each time you work on something, you're going to have questions. Some things will be obvious. Hopefully, how to add footage and start a project, whatever program you're using, hopefully that's kind of an obvious thing. Some things will be a little bit less obvious. How do I add a title? Maybe you want to add a transition or, do something a little more specific. I know for me, whenever I'm learning any kind of application, Google is like always right there. And every time it's like I do one thing, now I need to Google how to do the next thing. And it's so slow and it's so tedious. But typically, once you Google that once or twice, you now know how to do that thing and you won't have to look it up anymore. And if you're working on this regularly, you'll be surprised at how quickly you're like, I'm kind of proficient at this. This is super cool. If you're looking for a more solid recommendation on where to begin, obviously, personally, I love Final Cut Pro, which is a Mac-only application. I love it because it's stable, logical, super powerful, but also I don't find it very intimidating, and I've seen other people not find it intimidating. So that's what I like. I also, as we've talked about in the past, strongly recommend DaVinci Resolve. Premiere is obviously a very powerful editing program too, like we talked about in the previous episode. But Adobe's subscription plan is awful, and if you're not in the Adobe ecosystem and you don't need to be, I wouldn't recommend getting into it because it's bad. So, if you're going to use other Adobe software or you already have a subscription, then you have access to Premiere. But if you're not already in the Adobe world, don't jump into Premiere. Premiere is also it's got some baggage. It's got some baggage. So if you're starting from scratch and you have no loyalty or experience with anything, but you want to kind of go beyond maybe iMovie or like a basic online editor, that's where I would recommend looking into Final Cut Pro or Resolve. Resolve would probably be the one to do if you're planning to do work with a team at some point, maybe like a group of people, or even work with like a company as an editor or something like that, where it's not just you as the solo editor. I think Resolve is becoming more and more popular there. And if you're not using Resolve, the transition, once you learn Resolve, the transition to something like Premiere or even the basics of Avid would be pretty simple. Same with Final Cut Pro, but Final Cut Pro does kind of excel for an individual editor. If you're not working with anybody else, or working with a team or anything, Final Cut really excels there. So that, I don't want to get too into the software side of things, but that's what I would recommend there. And then, like I mentioned, having Google out while you're starting to edit, hugely important, or your search engine of choice. Ask Jeeves how to make a cut in your editing software if you need to. And of course, there are courses. And I don't say this as a shameless or shameful self-promotion for my own Final Cut Pro course, but it is a question, should I get an editing course? And I've known people, myself included, who have had good and bad experiences with courses. It's definitely something maybe to look into, not because the information cannot be found everywhere. And that's a thing that people oftentimes criticize courses for, is like, I could learn all this stuff on YouTube for free. It's like, yeah, you could, but deciphering all of that and filtering out all of that and finding all of that info is going to take a really long time. The benefit of a course should be that it curates and condenses really important information for you in a way that's easy to understand. And there are some things, like if you have like a Skillshare or a masterclass subscription, I think there's editing stuff on there. I think MKBHD has one on masterclass, and Skillshare, I know there's a ton on there. And then there's individual ones. There's ones like mine that aren't part of those, but it's just the person, makes or sells a course. So if you want to learn mine, you can go to learnfinalcutpro.com if you're interested in Final Cut. But there's courses for every application, and there's also courses that are more editing specific, not application specific. I kind of think a course could be a good way if there's one that you think is going to speak to you. And I say that as someone who created a course, but also as someone who's taken them. About a year ago, even though I've been editing for 20 years or more at that point, I enrolled in Casey Neistat's course that he came out with at the start of 2022, and I loved it. It was such a cool thing. I highly recommend it. Basically, throughout the only thing I didn't like about it was you get put in a group with people and you're supposed to actively be making projects with each other, and my schedule did not allow for that to happen, so I was completely a slacker in my group that did not create anything. But it was also like, I don't need to learn how to make my first video. I want to learn how Casey makes his videos, was kind of why I took it. And then I wanted access to those materials. And the duration of that course takes you through two projects. One really simple one that he makes just with a phone, and another one where it's like a more in-depth, high concept video that you might see on his. Actually, the video ended up actually being on his YouTube channel. So the neat part about that is, for the editing, each time they talked about editing, it was like a couple of videos that were an hour or more each of just him editing, just him hanging out, sometimes explaining stuff, sometimes not explaining stuff, but just watching him edit. And I learned so much from that, because no matter what, you could watch anybody do what they do and you're going to learn something from it. And, there are times, it doesn't mean they're doing everything perfectly, I guess I should say. If you take my course and you watch me edit a project, you're definitely going to go like, Tom, why aren't you doing this that way? And don't you know about this? Same thing when I was watching Casey's course. It was like, oh, he's doing this. Doesn't he know he could just click this one button and that'll be so much easier? That doesn't really matter. The technique and the structure and the style of what he was doing made sense and applied to my own workflow as well. And even in his case, like in Casey's case, he's been doing that for, many, many years at this point. So trying to unlearn and relearn the quote unquote correct way to do it probably won't even be efficient anyway. It's probably more efficient to just do things this way. So that was really cool. And honestly, the fun that I had watching somebody just edit is what gave me the push to then make my own Final Cut Pro course, because there is so much to cover in any application. I think that's what people get hung up on. They want to start learning how to edit. Whatever they choose, they think that they need to master from front to back that application entirely. And you absolutely don't need to do that. Most people will never know how to do everything in any application, even if they use it professionally, because you kind of you just end up using the parts of it and the pieces of that fit to your specific needs. Like Final Cut Pro has tons of 360 titles and editing and stuff. I don't like ever use those, but it's this huge part of the program that works really well that I never use. There's all kinds of stuff like that. You don't have to learn everything about a program before you can call yourself decent with it or before you can start using it. And anytime you watch someone else do anything, you'll learn something. And so that's when I realized, I don't need to wait. I've been using Final Cut Pro for so long. I taught it for, a solid decade, but I still didn't feel qualified to teach it until I realized, I can just do it from my way. So this is not the way, this is just my way. Watch and maybe you'll pick something up interesting from that. And that seems to work really well. So I definitely recommend checking out courses if you're the kind of person that sort of thing works for. I think you can get a lot out of it. And I know people who have pretty darn successful YouTube channels at this point, that the first time they ever edited a video was their first YouTube video a couple years ago. And they learned how to do that from a course that they took. And it totally works. Learning to edit is really important. If you want to make videos and you want to have a YouTube channel, actually spending the time learning to edit, I think is so important. When we were visiting my family over the holidays, they were kind of asking, like, it's always confusing, even if they're supportive, to understand what I do and what Heather does. And so my stepdad was asking, when you make something, like, do you spend more time filming it or more time editing it? And I was like, definitely more time on the editing than the actual filming. And I think that that's pretty common. And when you realize that, that's why I think it's really important to learn how to edit your own stuff. If you're somebody who, like, you want to have a YouTube channel, you want to be a freelancer, you want to make something, I think learning to edit is a crucial part of that process. Very, very much. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to always edit everything forever. I'm a total control freak, so I do not want anyone else editing my stuff at all, even if it would free up time. That's not anything I want. I want to edit. I have fun editing. I enjoy it. That's where I get to put the marks on the work that you actually see. Editing is so underrated in how important it is to a finished product. There's so many millions of decisions that you make, or that an editor makes when working on something, that you can't really pinpoint to any one specifically most of the time. Like, just because they chose to cut at this frame instead of letting it go for 3 more frames, that might not make a big difference in the final product. But all of those kinds of decisions over the course of an entire project shape it in a way where it's put together probably how nobody else could do it. Even if you're doing something as simple as like chopping up a talking head, you sit in front of your camera for 30 minutes, you record a talking head part, and then you're just trying to cut out, the obvious mistakes and the filler words. Even that has a certain style and a certain personality to it. And I think this is a very controversial opinion. So just remember that it's just my opinion and it's not a judgment. But I do think one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make is that they outsource their editing way too early and way too quickly. It seems like anytime I hear somebody talk about workflow, especially for YouTube and how to get better at their workflow, the number one thing that they'll be told by coaches and everything is find an editor, hire an editor, and I think that is a huge disservice to you. I think at some point, for some people, hiring an editor can be a great choice that makes things sustainable and lets them be better at what they do. But I think people who are like, they'll limp along and kind of like do some basic editing skills and they'll just pay someone and never think about it again, I think is a big mistake in the long run. Because for better or worse, even if you get the best editor in the world, you cannot get around the fact that somebody else's fingerprints are always going to be on your work if you're hiring an editor. There's too many decisions, too many creative choices to be made, where even if you give them very specific directions, it's still not going to be 100% what you would make. That's not necessarily a bad thing. There are people who have great relationships with their editor, and it's like a team, and the editor's personality, editor's style mixes with the creator's style, and they come together to form something, and that's its own unique thing that is really cool, as long as you know that that's what's going to happen. And some people spend so much time learning to edit and learning their style and understanding who they are and how it works that by the time they hire an editor, they have almost like an instruction manual of how to create one of their videos exactly. And I would argue that even if an editor follows that, it's still not going to be the same video that person would have made, but it's at least going to be pretty close. So, outsourcing at a certain point for some people can be the right choice to do. And obviously, if you are a freelance editor or you want to be an editor, it's great that people want to outsource their stuff because then you can be their editor and you have all kinds of stuff to work on. So, there's definitely a value to it, but it's something not to rush into. I kind of feel like it would be if I wanted to make a painting and I grabbed a canvas and just sort of like sketched out some lines in pencil and then gave somebody else like a box of paints, showed them the canvas and was like, cool, you just wrapped up this painting right here, and then they do the painting and then I sign my name on it. It's like, I guess I gave them the paint, I guess I gave them the idea and the direction, but what we're looking at is actually their work. That's kind of what happens when you outsource your editing, because editing is that crucial to the process. It is where things are put together. If you have just filmed a video and you haven't edited it, you don't have a video. Like the editing is where everything comes together, and it's just a really important thing. If you do hire an editor, I do think it's hugely important to build a relationship with them so they understand the goal, the style. You can work on things together. I've seen people have different versions where they'll hire an editor who only does the rough cuts of stuff. So they'll send all the raw footage, that person organizes it, gets the basics, sends the project back, and then the person, like the main creator, will then go through and like polish it all up and add in all the crazy stuff that they like to add. That's probably pretty effective. I've seen the opposite, where the creator will do the rough cut, choose what needs to be there, and then send it off for all the polishing. It's different for everybody. And if at some point outsourcing your editing is what makes sense for you for any number of reasons, that's cool. I don't think you should do that though until you know how to edit. I was going to say until you're not escaping editing, but you've chosen for the sake of your workflow to hire out the editing, but not just as an excuse so you don't have to edit anymore. I don't think that that's if you're somebody who's interested in making videos, I think it's very important that you learn how to edit videos. And at its core, because what you're doing is you're taking everything, and at its very core, editing is just cutting and reordering. So if you don't know where to begin and it feels really intimidating in any application, that's it. You're just taking footage, you're cutting it up a little bit, and you're putting it in order. Just start there. Going back to that talking head clip that I mentioned a moment ago, if you recorded your talking head clip, maybe you recorded 2 of them, different locations, about different topics, I don't know. You just need to cut out the parts you don't need and put them in an order that makes sense, right? Maybe when you're filming, you talk about something like, hey, here's a point that I'm talking about this right now. And then you have a thought and you're like, oh, earlier I do this all the time. I leave notes to myself when I'm filming for editing. I'll say like, oh, earlier I forgot to say this thing. So put this part after that, blah, 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 blah. And then I say that part. And then when I'm editing, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, cut that out, boop, drag it over here, move it by this part. Not a problem at all. You're just cutting and reordering. That is really simple. And when you're cutting, all you're doing is you have this clip and you're just essentially getting rid of mistakes, maybe getting rid of filler words or extra stuff. If you're recording your video and you say a part of it and then you stop talking because you have to look over and read your notes or think about something for 40 seconds and it's just 40 seconds of you sitting there in silence, that's not a mistake, but obviously it's something you're going to cut out. If you're saying lots of filler words, lots of ums, uhs, likes, maybe you're cutting out some of those, although you don't want to get too aggressive with that because then things can be like unnaturally cut. But that's basically it. Getting rid of mistakes, putting things in an order that makes sense. That's the absolute basic foundation of editing. Maybe you'll want to add a title or something, maybe a little bit of music. And that right there is a whole video. Even without the title and the music, just instead of just a raw clip of you like working through thoughts, condensing it into something that makes sense and has no filler, right there, that's a whole video. You've edited a video, even though all you've done is cut some things out, add in a title, add in some music. Now it feels a little more polished. Maybe as time goes on, you're going to start realizing, oh, every time I cut, there's sort of this little pop sound just because you're sort of cutting in the middle of a sound wave or the middle of a word, and you can kind of hear that audio transition. Oh, what if I put in a little fade right there? And that way the audio fades in very subtly so no one would even notice. But now these two sentences that sounded stuck together, now they sound like one sentence put together. You can't hear the cut between them. Cool. That might be something you do over time. Maybe you accidentally discover something like J or L cuts, which is when you see or hear something before you see or hear it. So, for example, if I am filming a review video, say for this microphone, the Lewitt LCT 240, and I have a shot that's me with a talking head, and I say, wow, the Lewitt LCT 240 is an absolutely amazing microphone. It has all kinds of cool features. If I want to cut to a B-roll clip where I say it has all kinds of cool features, instead of starting that clip right when that clip of me talking starts, I could nudge it over just a little bit so that way we cut to that clip before I even get to that part. So here's my review of the LCT 240. As I'm saying that right at the end, for just a second or two, you'll start to see the B-roll clip, and then the next part of me talking will come in where I talk about it has all these features. That's essentially what we're talking about. You can do the opposite too. Maybe I have some B-roll. Here's this awesome shot of the microphone. Maybe there's some music playing. And now you start to hear my voice. Maybe I'm saying the first half of a sentence before it cuts to me. And now you see me on camera saying the rest of that sentence. That's all that J and L cuts are. They're pretty simple. Most people end up discovering them by accident and then realizing that things flow really well. Once you become familiar with them and you start looking for them in movies, TV shows and stuff, you will realize that they are everywhere, and they're a wonderful way to make a bunch of stuff that doesn't seem like it goes together. Footage, several clips that are all kind of mashed together, helps everything just flow together in this really great way. But that's it. I mean, even getting into something like J cuts or L cuts is almost a more intermediate level of editing. That's it. If you're scared of editing, that's all you're doing is just cutting out stuff you don't need, putting things in an order that makes sense. That's it. That's the basis of everything. And the very first projects you make will mostly just be that. And that's a good place to start. I think that's a good place to be if you can edit through stuff and have something that makes sense. And then that's when you start kind of learning more about the why and the purpose behind how you edit. Because at first you're so just swimming in the technical details. How do I import this footage? This shot's too bright. How do I fix that? How do I cut something up? And then you have your stuff and you're like, hey, I've cut out all of the mistakes. I've cut out all of the filler words that I wanted to get rid of. And now I have this nice solid thing here. After a while, you might realize, well, wait, just because I cut out the mistakes doesn't mean everything that's left is necessary. There are so many times when you organize something, you record something, you plan it out, and you think that the things you're saying and the things you're including are necessary. And then when you really sit back and watch it while you're editing, you're like, you know what? This kind of repeats what I already said earlier, or this goes in a direction that's not really related to the topic. Nobody needs to know about this. And then you can just cut that out. So that's kind of an intermediate phase of editing right there, is once you have everything done, which would essentially be a rough edit, there's no mistakes. There's nothing that would be bad to publish or share, but there's maybe stuff that's not effective to publish or share. And then you go through and you start literally editing I'm thinking of like a magazine editor or a newspaper editor where you go through a story and you cut stuff out, a book editor, and you rearrange things and you're like, okay, I'm not adding to this, but I'm probably still taking away from it or reordering a little bit more. And that moves into that philosophical side. So the technical side here, if we're talking about learning how to edit, if you notice, the trick to learn how to edit is to edit. It's practice. It's the least sexy, least exciting answer there is. It's just keep editing. Just keep trying to make something. Make sure that you never hesitate to reach out to Google. And if you're somebody who is able to learn through courses, seeking out courses for either the style or even the specific application that you're using is a great way to go. And then it's just, I swear, once you edit 5 projects, you're going to feel like, oh my gosh, this is so much easier now. I feel so much better. And your 5th project is going to look and sound so much better than your first project did, even if you don't feel like you really advanced that much along the way. Although it'll probably be pretty easy to tell that you've advanced. So The same would go. This is good beginner advice if you're just trying to jump into video editing, but also if you want to jump into a new application, you're using something and you want to learn a new application, and that can be really difficult if, like I've been using Final Cut Pro for so long that I'm so quick with it, I'm so effective with it, but if I'm curious about how DaVinci Resolve works and I want to edit something in Resolve, I can learn it, but I have to be willing to go back to that very slow beginning of like Googling everything I'm trying to do, which is fine. And just remembering that that's how it is. Every time you use the application, you're going to get a little bit better at it and a little more effective with it. And that's kind of how you learn anything, is to just try it out and seek out help along the way without putting the pressure on yourself to feel like you need to know everything about it before you can get started. So let's now jump into part 2, the philosophical side of editing. We'll have a lot more technical questions, but this side I think is very important. And again, just my own opinions all right here. Just like we talked about in the last point, which really is sort of the border from the technical to the philosophical, just because something is correct does not necessarily make the project better. So that both goes towards, hey, I cut out all the mistakes, my project must be good now. Maybe there's still more you need to cut out, but also you might learn specific rules while you're editing, like, oh, you should always keep your audio at this certain level, or adjust your shots this way, adjust your exposure or color or whatever this way. And those are good rules to learn, but there are times when maybe you can break those rules, or, there are definitely times where I've wanted to work on something and make it as polished and nice as possible, but maybe for one reason or another, I'm missing a certain shot or a certain clip, and the only thing I have is like a shaky shot from a phone. So the whole project is like beautiful looking, and then there's this one like phone clip. And it's like, well, I'm not going to use that because it's not going to fit in. It's like, okay, maybe it's not as technically correct or perfect as everything else is, but would the project actually be worse off for not including it? Maybe by adding in this thing or breaking this rule in some way, I'm actually making the project better. That's something to kind of always keep in mind. It kind of involves you getting your ego out of the way a little bit. Like, I would never have something that's shaky or blurry or whatever. Everything I need to have should be perfect. But it's like, yeah, is anyone really going to care about that you didn't have anything blurry or shaky at all? Or are they going to be more interested that they got to see and hear something that was more relevant to the story? And that ties into the next point, which is pacing. Pacing is huge, and it's very hard to learn. It's almost like learning an instrument. You pick up a guitar and you try to play for the first time. You might know some notes or some chords. You might read some tabs, and you can put all the notes together in an order, but it's learning the rhythm, right? The timing of how everything comes together to make the song sound correctly. Editing is exactly the same. Pacing is huge. You probably don't always just want a wall of sound. Something like a tutorial maybe there's no time and breath because you're just teaching a topic and it's just kind of plowing through. But a lot of times maybe you need silence. Maybe you're switching subjects and you need to like bring into music for a little bit and then come back. Maybe you need to let a sentence or a thought breathe for a second. Let there be silence, and then continue into the next thought. And that's a very hard thing to learn. And the only way to do it is to just start paying attention to what you like and to try to put yourself in the viewer's seat as much as possible while you're editing, because that's a tough thing to do, is to sit back there and try to throw away all the knowledge you have about the project and to watch it as if you're somebody who knows nothing about it and is seeing everything for the first time with no additional context. That helps a lot with pacing. For YouTube, the YouTube school of editing currently, and a lot of what YouTube coaches hammer home, is retention, which we've talked about before, and lots of people have talked about. That's not necessarily good editing. I don't want to condemn it totally. I'm thinking of like the Mr. Beast style of editing where there's nothing is on screen for more than like half a second and they're just flashing stuff everywhere to keep somebody's attention. I don't think that is the best way to do it. I saw a video recently that was talking about this editing style, And they referred to it as like a car accident or a train wreck, where that's something that's going to get everybody's attention. But it's not necessarily going to, it's not even like how you would want to get their attention. It's not really going to stick with them. Like, what happened over there? Oh, there's an accident. Crazy. You have my attention. But as soon as it's gone, I'm not thinking about it anymore. Other than, hoping everybody is okay. But it's kind of that thing like, wow, I'm paying attention to this video because it's forcing my brain to not look away, but I don't care about it at all. And I'm not going to think about it again once I'm done watching it. That's kind of what happens there a lot. But editing for retention, if you take that weird Mr. Beastian YouTube like algorithmic view of it and you think of what retention is, it's attention. How long is somebody paying attention to what you're making? And can you do things that are interesting? Has it just been you on screen for 8 minutes? Can you put something else? Can you punch in, crop in a little bit, crop out a little bit to emphasize points, to make things a little interesting? Could you cut to a B-roll clip? Is there something you could show that's going to illustrate a point a little bit more? Anytime there's a chance to show, not tell, that's probably a good thing when it comes to video editing. Things that are going to help that viewer, if you can put yourself in their shoes, not have their mind wander. If you're watching your project and you notice that then you're starting to think about something else, like what you want to eat for dinner or something else you want to work on, that's important to pay attention to when your mind started drifting. Why did it start? What was boring about this? Is it because you've heard it 60 times, or is it because maybe something is wrong with the editing? I know whenever I listen to Simpsons commentaries, which was something I loved like when I was in college and got all the Simpsons DVD box sets, listening to commentary is one of my favorite things to do. And there's so many times throughout at least the early seasons, which I love, where the writers are talking about, there's a joke, they say, that joke's good, but we actually had this better joke, but we changed it at the last minute. And the reason they changed it is because they came up with a joke, they loved it, but then through, revisions and recording and editing and all this stuff, they heard that joke 50 or 60 times and it stopped being funny. And so then they thought of like, well, what about this joke? And here's another one. That's a brand new joke, so it seems funny. Let's put that in. The show's done. Let's air it. Realizing later, like, that first joke was actually funnier. We just got tired of it. And that's an important thing when you're editing, is to go through it. If your mind is wandering, is it wandering because you're just so familiar with this that you are bored of it, but somebody else wouldn't be? Or is it something that is going to have a hard time keeping somebody else's attention? It's a tricky thing. If you find yourself in that position, one of the things I recommend doing while you're editing is to give yourself a break. Leave. Go do something else. Maybe come back the next day. Give yourself time to like get out of the editing not literally like your headset, like your headphones, but headspace. Go do something else. Maybe it's just for an hour or two. Maybe it's for the next day. Maybe it's a week later. And then come back with a fresh perspective and fresh eyes to work on the project, which is also an important thing to keep in mind as you get near the end of a project. This is something I learned about myself maybe like 2 years ago. It can feel really fun when you're about to finish editing a project and you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. You're like, okay, I just need to, polish up the last 3 minutes of this, do the audio, add in a graphic, and I'll be done. I can just power through. I know I've been doing this for 7 hours, but I can just put in 90 more minutes and I'll be done. And that might be true. And, if you're working professionally or for a client, you might have a deadline where that has to be true. But if that's not the case, once you find yourself having that, like the lights at the end of the tunnel, I'm just going to go for it, even though I'm tired and I kind of don't want to, I recommend stopping and coming back the next day, because you are not in a position where you're going to be doing the bare minimum, like the good enough. This is good enough. That's fine. This is good enough. If you come back with a fresh perspective, not only are you going to start maybe noticing some stuff from the day before, where you're like, oh, I thought this was good, but it actually does make sense if I flip these, or, hey, that little, thing could be cut out because it sounds weird. You'll pay attention to that stuff. And then on the remaining stuff that you're editing, you're going to just be more energized to put more effort into it. All those thoughts you have where it's like, should I put in a B-roll clip here? Nah, it doesn't need it. You'll take the extra time to put in that clip. Should I add a graphic? Should I add a sound effect? Yeah, I'm going to do that. All of those things really make a huge, huge difference and separate very amateur looking and sounding stuff from much more professional looking and sounding stuff. So giving yourself a break, coming back with fresh eyes. And another thing I recommend, I guess this is sort of on the border of being technical or philosophical, is not always starting from the beginning. Once you've done, a couple passes of your project, you've done the rough cut, maybe you've done, some other revisions and things. Say you have a 20-minute project or a 15-minute project. If every time you sit down to work on it, you start at frame 1 and press play and then go through and edit it, what you might notice is that the first 3 minutes are just really well put together and super tightly edited. But by minute 13, it's like, there's no more B-roll. There's no more sound effects. There's no more, there's just, it's fine. There's nothing technically wrong with it, but it doesn't have that same level of attention that the first part of the video had. And it makes sense. You get tired, you get fatigued. Of course, there are reasons why maybe the beginning of a video, especially on YouTube, would need to be a little more engaging than the middle or the end, because you want to hook somebody's attention. You want to bring them in. Once they've decided that they're on board and they're watching, you kind of don't have to keep selling them anymore, but you also don't want to bore them or waste their time. So sometimes when you come back to a project, if you start in the middle of your timeline or the last third of your timeline, start editing from there with fresh eyes, then you're going to notice, wow, the back section of this project has just as much care and time put into it as the front does, and everything feels a lot more well balanced. And that's also probably going to help you come back at it with a better understanding of what to keep and what to get rid of. If you've ever heard the phrase, murder your darlings, it's true. That's what you have to learn how to do. I cannot tell you the number of times I've had something in a project that I loved. Maybe it was a short sequence or a specific shot or a joke, whatever it might be, something I loved in a project. And I really had to be honest with myself and realize that if I cut that out, the whole thing is so much better. I lose that thing I love. Maybe it's this amazing camera work that I'm just so proud of, and it's, the lighting was perfect and the sun burst around the corner and it's amazing. But if I get rid of that, whatever it might be, I'm sad because I lose that, but suddenly everything around it flows together much better, and now the whole project is much, much stronger. So once you start having your project come together, the thing about murdering your darlings, as gruesome as it sounds, is to really go through and be kind of brutal with what you need and what you don't need, and what somebody who's not attached to this stuff, they don't know that, yes, you got this camera shot and it was amazing, and you had to camp out in the darkness for 3 hours to get this one specific shot, and it was so much work, but it's perfect. Is it actually helping the project or not? If not, get rid of it and see how much better everything becomes. The other thing to worry about, this was something I had to work on with my students and myself a lot, is what you imagined making versus what you actually made. I used to have a little Venn diagram I'd put together. When my students would do project reviews, I had to really I'd have them pitch their projects. So whether it was an individual or a team, instead of just going through and going like, oh, here's this group's project, let's watch it. There was like a little stage, and they would get up and they were supposed to pitch us on their project. And the goal of the pitch, just like it would be to, I don't know, a network or a studio, was to get us excited about the project, to get us rooting for you to succeed. It's high school. I mean, every project anyone has ever made has problems, right? There's always something that could be improved. But when you're in 9th or 10th grade and it's, one of the first things you've ever made, you're going to have all kinds of problems. Everything's going to look and sound weird, and there's problems everywhere. We know that. The goal is to get us so excited about it that we're rooting for you that we can overlook those or don't even care about those. And you just want to tell us about your idea. We wanted to tell this story about a thing that does this, and this is, whatever it is going to get us excited about it. The thing I always had to work with every class on every grade level was not turning their pitches into disclaimers, because it was such a natural thing to think of all the stuff. It's like, afterwards when we would do critiques, it's like the YouTube comment section. What's everyone going to say? We'll address that up front. Yeah, I know the sound is bad. I know the audio, the picture's really dark in this part and the camera's shaky and the ending doesn't make any sense, but here's our project. And I would have to explain to them, based on what you've just told us, why would anyone want to watch this? And say that in as kind of a way as possible. And I would equate it to, especially in the world of high school, asking someone out on a date. If you say, hey, I really like you. Do you want to go to the movies this weekend? Or there's this really great new restaurant that opened up that I've been wanting to try. Do you want to try it out with me this weekend? Not that I would ever be so confident as to ask anyone that, but that's at least a way to sell somebody on the idea of going on a date with you. You wouldn't want to say, hey, I'm pretty rude. I don't bathe a lot. I'm a little bit abusive, and I will totally be manipulative and weird. Do you want to go out with me? No, you're not really selling anyone on that idea, right? I'm not saying lie, but I'm saying like, I guess that sounds like what I'm saying there, but it's like you want people to be on your side. You don't want to just turn them off and they're like, whoa, why did nobody like my project? Well, did you see how you sold it to everybody? And that's not unique to high school. That's how many YouTube videos have you watched where everything's fine, you're watching it, and suddenly like text or something will pop up on screen, or they'll do the thing where they cut to them like, editing Tom here. I just wanted to point out that I know the air conditioner was on in the background. You can hear the rumble, but I hope it's not too distracting. As the viewer, I'm like, yo, editor Tom, I don't care about, I didn't notice the air conditioner. Now you pointed out, you distracted me from what we're talking about. Now I am noticing the air conditioner. If you hadn't said anything, I wouldn't have noticed anything about it at all. And I think that's the reason that happens is you might be aware of a mistake. You're always going to be your own worst critic, but you're also cursed with the knowledge of what you wanted to make. Before you start making anything, you probably have an idea of what you want it to be, even if it's the most simple project in the world, just for like personal fun. You probably have an idea in your mind of like, yeah, I want it to look like this, sound like this. This is what it's going to be like. And then the actual project starts coming together. And sometimes it doesn't look or feel very much like what you imagined at all. And there's a big gap. If it were a Venn diagram, if you had one circle that was what you planned to make and another circle that was what you actually made, there's no overlap between them at a certain point. And that can feel really bad. But even at the beginning, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That doesn't mean the thing you actually made isn't great and doesn't stand on its own right. And that's what I would tell my students a lot is we don't know what your original intent was. I mean, I did as their teacher because, we planned the projects, but we didn't know what your original intent was. All we know is what we're seeing on screen right now. That's what we're judging. Do we like this? Does this make sense? You're judging it from the point of view of how it's not living up to your expectations. It's like a parent with way too high expectations, not looking at their child for who they are, but rather who they have failed to be. As time goes on and you build your skills, there can be more overlap between those things. It does become easier, and more consistently can you make the thing you actually create resemble what you originally intended. But at first, there's probably quite a bit of distance between those. And even as time goes on, just based on circumstances, you can be really good, but things beyond your control put a lot of distance there. It doesn't mean that you have failed, and it doesn't mean that anything is bad. It just means that you need to step back and look at what actually exists and judge it based on that, not on how it's failing to live up to expectations. Because I think a lot of times you might get to the point where you're done editing a project and you might feel disappointed in it because that's what you're looking at. But if you sit back, especially leave for a bit, come back with fresh eyes, watch it for what it is, you might realize, dang, that's actually pretty good. Like it's not perfect. Nothing's ever going to be perfect, but it's pretty good. Because if you want to make something perfect, you'll just never finish that project. Nobody's ever made a perfect project, myself very, very much included, which kind of goes to my last point that's on the more philosophical side of editing, which has to do with croissants? Constraints. It's all about croissants. That was weird. I have found that giving yourself constraints can be hugely effective in so many things. Basically, you have to stop editing at some point. And even if you don't have a deadline, it's not something that anyone else is waiting on. In theory, you could just keep working on this thing for years. It's probably not the best thing to be able to do that. At a certain point, you do need to be able to wrap up a project and then move on to the next one for your own benefit and for your own growth and for the benefit of the project. So if you are going to share it with other people, they can see it, or if somebody's waiting for it, they get what they're waiting for. So giving yourself constraints can sometimes be very, very helpful, especially in the later parts of editing. What I have done sometimes is, as I'm editing a project, I kind of go through and I mark points where I'm like, oh, I should add a shot of this here, like where I want to add B-roll. And then I have all those B-roll clips and I add them in. And sometimes at a certain point, it's like, I have enough. The video's not boring. It's fine. But I find myself like, well, I could go film this one other thing. I could do that. It's like, okay, do I really need to go get out the camera, set up the lights, do the thing to film this one shot for 4 seconds? Is that going to make the project way better? Or is that going to take up more time that maybe I shouldn't be spending on it? And that kind of becomes a delicate balancing act later in the editing process. And so sometimes what I'll do is I'll give myself a constraint and I'll go like, okay, no more footage is being added to this project. No more assets, no more footage. What is in here is in here. I'm going to pretend that I'm editing this while I'm out of town on vacation and I have no access to anything else. And I have to make it work with what is happening in here. And it's shocking how effective and the creative solutions you can come up with a constraint like that. Maybe it's a time limit. Maybe it's like, okay, I'm going to give myself 60 more minutes and that's it to work on this project. So wherever I get to in 60 minutes, that's the end of the project. I know for like, I'm not sure if he's still doing this 100%, but for Peter Lindgren on his vlog channel, when we were like hanging out talking about how we edit stuff, he was telling me that the way his vlog channel could be sustainable was that he never spends more than 2 hours on the edit, and that's it, which is still a pretty long time, but his vlogs are really good. So, but on a normal video, maybe he'll spend 12, 15, 18 hours on the edit. So 2 hours is a really short amount of time, something you can do at the end of the day or early in the morning before you start doing something else. And that's his time constraint. So whatever he can put together, as good as he can make that video within 2 hours, that's a video that goes out. But he's not going to spend 3 hours to make it even better. Those constraints can be really, really, really helpful as time goes on, I think. And it's crazy how you can get creative when you do have constraints. One thing I learned pretty early teaching, especially as like my first digital media program was getting up and running, I sometimes would think, here's going to be a treat for this class. Instead of me giving them a prompt with all these requirements, I'm going to let them do whatever they want. They just have to turn something in by this date and they have total creative freedom. And it took me a couple times of trying what I thought was going to be this really cool experimental thing to realize, oh, a bunch of them are just paranoid, paralyzed and confused. And they kind of need a little constraints. As soon as I added in a little something, you can make whatever you want. It's due in a week, but it needs to be exactly 60 seconds long. Or it needs to include one visual effect, either practical or digital. If I just gave them one little constraint, then it's almost like, I don't know, a bunch of just random dust floating through space, not doing anything. But as soon as there's like a little point of matter or, I don't know, density or whatever for these things to start coalescing around, then something can be built up around it. And so the idea of like, oh, think outside the box and break down your barriers and stuff, it's great and it makes sense, but sometimes you need to give yourself a constraint in order to make the best work you can. And that's something that's been hugely, hugely helpful for me as I edit. As we're coming up on nearly an hour, it's time to dive into questions. So I did ask questions on Instagram. I have a handful there, but most of the questions, I do want to thank everyone who submitted them. Most of the questions we're going to go over are from channel supporters. So everyone who's gone out of their way to support either the channel or this podcast on Patreon and YouTube channel memberships. Appreciate that. Appreciate that very much. So that's where most of the questions are going to come from. Most of these relate to technical things, but it's kind of the age-old thing of, if you have a question, someone else probably has that question too. So I didn't answer every question, or I won't answer every question that's submitted, but there were a lot of really great ones, and I'm just going to kind of go through in no real particular order. Let's start with Instagram, just because I have this window up here and I would like to close it. So I've got a handful of questions from Instagram. One is from Corey Mayo Media. Asks, how do you determine the perfect background music volume over dialogue? This is a very good question and a very difficult question. Ultimately, what I'll say, which might not be the correct answer, so if there's like a professional editor listening, they might scream, but they'll scream at the appropriate level, is what sounds right is right. That's very subjective because what you're listening on might be different from what other people are listening on, which is why having a good set of headphones or a really nice pair of like speaker monitors listen to things on that's not going to artificially enhance certain sound qualities or frequencies is very important. Trying to make stuff that sounds good on every device, a phone, a huge entertainment sound system. Maybe someone's going to play this in a theater somewhere, or just through like a busted pair of old headphones. Is it going to sound as good as possible on all those? Background music is very tricky because it can make things, sometimes you really need it to help something feel right, but also it can get in the way of dialogue. So I don't think there's a perfect level. I can just tell you what I do. What I normally do is put in a song and start by lowering it to about negative 27 decibels. And that gives me a pretty good idea of how the song will or won't fit in with that dialogue. From there, what I'll usually do is scoop the mids. Now I have a whole video all about this, and I'll put a link to this video in the show notes. It's a very simple thing to do that you can do in any editing application that lets you bring up an equalizer. But essentially, you're just reducing, it's almost like you're taking an ice cream scoop and you're just scooping out the middle frequencies of the sound. And the reason that you want to do that is because it's those frequencies that most voices fall into. You know, people have low voices and high voices, but most human voice is going to be in the mid-range frequencies somewhere. So if you take those out of the music, now you have created a space sonically for the dialogue to fit into. And if you've ever watched movies and TV shows that are professionally mixed, I know there's like a thing where it's like if something is, you know, the dialogue is so quiet and the explosions are so loud, that's a whole separate thing. But if you've ever watched something where it's like there's music playing, it sounds loud, but I can still hear everyone just fine. How are they doing that? This is probably one of the ways they're doing it, especially if you're just working with a mono or a stereo mix. You're not trying to do like surround sound, THX, I don't know, 5.1 or whatever, just more basic audio. You can I'll put my video so you can watch that in Final Cut, but basically you just kind of, you don't eliminate them entirely. You just sort of lower, kind of start in the middle, lower that, and then just sort of create like a little smiley face, a shallow smiley face. And you'll find that even without changing the audio level anymore, the dialogue and the music fit together a lot better now after doing that. And sometimes adjust from there. Typically, I have found that my background music ends up being around negative 31 decibels sometimes, but it depends on the song. Sometimes it'll go up, sometimes it'll go down. If the song is, you know, has a lot of low end, like it's a lot of just rhythm and bass and stuff, I can probably keep the volume up a little bit more because the voice is probably not taking up those frequencies. If the song has a lot more like guitar or higher end instruments, higher frequency range instruments, then I probably need to lower it a little bit more to make it fit. So there is no perfect one, but that's how I find the levels that I use. Let's see here. Here's a similar one, which is also very important. Dr. Benthal asks, how do you handle loudness in your podcast? That's what you're listening to right now. And there is a difference. Curtis Judd has an awesome video on the difference between loudness and volume and all these different things, why you can have stuff set to the same levels, but it sounds entirely different. There's a bunch of reasons for it that I don't fully understand. But the way I handle it is a little bit different for video and audio. So for video, I always edit with my audio meters turned on. So you always want to be able to see your audio meters bouncing up and down. In Final Cut Pro, that's just Shift Command 8. It'll pop up the audio meters. You want to make sure that nothing is clipping, nothing is going into the red. You probably don't want a lot of things bouncing up into the yellow. Typically, I try to keep my levels right around the negative 12 mark, maybe a little bit above it. If anything, I'm guilty of keeping the level a little too low, and it should go up higher. But I'm just so scared of clipping and making stuff sound bad on people's sound systems. So typically between negative 12, negative 6, that's kind of where stuff hangs out for me for video. For audio, it's a little bit different. For audio, the podcasts, I typically try to keep them at negative 16, which is just, I believe that's just kind of like a standard, and it just sort of, it plays nice across a bunch of different platforms, a bunch of different services, different players. So audio, I tend to do negative 16. Video, I tend to do negative 12. Generally, somewhere around there, you're probably going to be pretty good. A good rule of thumb that I've always sort of worked by, especially with video, is that negative 12 is kind of where everything should be averaging. -6 is where if something needs to get loud, maybe there is an explosion, maybe somebody needs to yell, whatever, that's where we're going to jump up into -6 or a little above that. If you're getting up towards 0, that's not where you want to be. That's where you're going to start clipping, which is, it's not just going to sound loud, it's going to sound distorted, and your audio is going to be ruined, which is not what you want to do. So those are our Instagram questions. There were a few more, but we've kind of already discussed them in a few of the other topics. So now we're going to move on to channel supporter questions, but the same thing, just all about editing and stuff. Keith White asks, is this specifically for editing podcasts or videos? If it's for videos, I'd like to hear a bit about color grading. Something I've had trouble dialing in as I have no idea how to do it. I've played around with color wheels, but I don't know what's supposed to look good. My ZV-E10 does pretty good with color right out of the camera for the most part. I recently started using your Ecamm LUT, and it did make the video more color accurate and not quite as dull. Color grading. I do touch on this in my Final Cut Pro course a bit, but not much. I'm going to add in a little bit more about color grading. It's definitely not my area of strength. There are ways, and I talk about this in the course, like there's a technically correct way and a stylistically correct way. Color correct and color grade, I guess, are two different things. So color correcting is when you get your footage and now you're trying to make the colors accurate. So if you've ever seen somebody hold up one of those things, it looks like a little booklet and it has all the squares of different colors on it. That's because those are like the true versions of those colors. You can hold that up on camera, and then when you're editing, you can open up like your color spectrum. I forget what it's called. The circle thingy with all the colors on it. And you can try to make sure that things are aligning. You can basically isolate colors. Are the greens from this lining up with where green should be? Are the reds lining up where the red should be? And that's how you can tell things are correct. It's looking right. That's really beneficial if you're using multiple cameras, and that way you want to make sure that the color green looks the same on every camera, and skin tones look the same across every camera. There is another specific way to handle skin tones, which is pretty similar. I cover this in my course. There's a bunch of YouTube videos. It's tough to go into on audio only, but that's all color correction. Color grading is more of the stylistic, like, how do I actually want this to look? If you've Breaking Bad, such a good example of everything in Mexico is just orange. Now we're in Mexico. We crossed the border. Everything's orange now. Obviously, that's not what it looks like just because you're in Mexico. Like, it can be really cold and cloudy and overcast, but no, everything's bright orange. That's a stylistic choice to help communicate where the story is taking place, to maybe help communicate like heat and exhaustion and all that kind of stuff. If you've seen movies where characters have, I'm talking a lot about color temperature, but think of a movie where there's a family dinner, it's Thanksgiving or something, and everyone's around the table and the footage you're watching is really warm. It's maybe there's even like a kind of a mist filter on the lens to soften things up. Lots of oranges, lots of warmth, lots of bright light. Some stuff is done on camera, some stuff is done in editing. Say there's a scene in that movie later where the character comes back to that same room where everybody ate, but now it's totally empty and they're really sad and it's dark and it's blue and there's a lot of just gray, blue, maybe some purples. It feels very cold. That's the kind of stuff where color grading is going to help communicate a mood. In something like a YouTube video, like my YouTube videos, personally, it's just all preference. Like, I love bright colors, so I'm going to boost up the saturation a little bit, try to keep the skin tones from making me look, weirdly artificially tanned, and try to just make things look the way I think they look most accurately. And that's sort of it. So honestly, I just eyeball it a lot and try to just do what I like until it looks the way that I like. And that's kind of what I do. Even like you mentioned, the Ecamm LUT. Yeah, mine is mostly about like making things pop, not necessarily making them correct. And if it works, it works, right? So I've spent time doing the really correct thing. I think this is something that's really funny. When people get into using cameras, I'm going to be a little bit critical here, but when people get into filming, one of the things they'll start doing is using log footage, which is that really, really flat color profile on your camera. So Keith mentioned his ZV-E10 looks great. The colors out of your camera are put together and designed, whatever picture profile you're using, if it's a default one, that's by like career engineers. People who are scientists in this stuff decided this is how these colors should be processed. Very few of us are going to slide a few things in Final Cut Pro and do a better job. And so it's funny when I've seen when people start using log footage, they put in so much extra steps into their workflow to end up with something that looks almost as good as the default picture profile. But because they can quickly do the back and forth, like this is what it looked like before when it was all flat and washed out, and this is what it looks like now where there's color and contrast, it feels like you did a lot more. But it's like, yeah, you could have just skipped that step and just filmed with like a default picture profile, and it would actually probably look better. I'm not saying don't film in log ever. There's definitely reasons to, but I think that's an important thing. We're like, I bought this camera. The colors look really good. Do I need to keep adjusting it? Probably not, because the camera has been designed by career professionals in this field. Log footage, though, I mean, like, again, if you're matching cameras, if you're going for a specific style, log footage also for dynamic range, which is the difference between things that are really bright and really dark in a frame, that's where it's huge. If you don't want to have just pure black in your shadows, and you don't want to have just a blown out pure white sky, but you want to be able to make the sky blue, see what's happening in the shadows, that's where log footage can come in, and you can adjust the exposure. You can decide what you want to, crush and what you want to overexpose, or, how you want your exposure to be. To me, log footage is a tool for exposure more than anything, not so much color, although it is both. And I know that's a very oversimplified statement, but that's what I say there. I see Pete Breen also asked, color grading for dummies. Me. That's basically there. I do talk on it in the course a little bit, and I'll add more, and I show how to do it in the course, but it's just tough to do. It's tough to do over audio, and I don't have a video on the channel. But if you find, I know Peter has a ton of color grading stuff, and there's all kinds of awesome, very technically correct ways to color grade out there. I would advise you, though, not to get too caught up in doing things the way that feels like you should, the technically correct way to do it. Here's Kane Treble. We're in Treble now. Cutting it to the beat, archiving footage and licensing music. So we're talking about our audio cutting to the beat. In Final Cut, my favorite way to cut to the beat is to use markers. So if you press the M key, it will put a little marker on your footage. And so as you're playing through a song, I kind of like listen to the beat and then sort of just like tap, tap, whenever there's a beat or something I want to cut on. And then you can just automatically align clips to those markers or fine tune them if you need to. That's sort of an easy way to do it. Cutting to the beat is really fun. It is something that does get criticized sometimes, and I think that's important too. It doesn't automatically mean something is amazing because it's cut to the beat of the song. However, I do think it helps a lot. I do think sometimes, if you're cutting to the rhythm of something and now we're seeing a shot and it's a really interesting shot, but because this tempo means now we got to cut to the next thing, and now you've cut away from that shot too soon and people are not going to be as interested in what's coming up next. You're probably, that's not helping the purpose or the story or whatever you're trying to communicate. But cutting to the beat can also add in a lot of energy. What I like about it is that it helps you incorporate music in a way where you can't just add in another song instead. We used to do music videos in my classes, and one thing that I would do with my students is see if we could just add another song. They'd make their music video. Can I take out the song you added in and just put in a different song and have it work, or have it not make a difference? If it didn't make a difference, I viewed that as being a problem. I kind of thought not that the whole thing had to be cut to the beat, but the music and the audio should be linked together in enough of a way where they are one thing now. They've been married. They're one till death do us part, till deletion do us part. You can't just swap it out because it's not going to fit anymore. And I think that's a really important thing, is listening to what the music is, paying attention to what the visuals are, remembering what the purpose is, and then trying to cut the two together in a way that makes the most sense. But yeah, beat markers work really well. And otherwise, it's just a lot of frame stuff. In Final Cut Pro, you can either select a whole clip or even just the edge of a clip and use the period and comma keys to nudge things over just one frame at a time. And that's kind of how I align things. It's why I really don't recommend ever using any kind of wireless headphones to edit, because there's always going to be a very, very, very slight bit of latency, even with the best ones. And if you're trying to cut very accurately to the beat or sync a dialogue, for example, it's never going to be exactly perfect. And so if you use wired headphones or, wired monitors, then there's not going to be any latency and you're going to cut things accurately. It really sucks if you edit a whole sequence and then you realize the whole thing is off by like 2 frames. It's not fun. Archiving footage. I know there's another question about archiving, so I'm going to come back to that part. Licensing music. That's an important one. I would recommend, just when it comes to licensing music, my philosophy is don't close doors on yourself. If you know that the thing you're doing is just for funsies, like at home or between friends or whatever, use all the copyrighted music you want, absolutely. But if you want to share it anywhere else outside of your home, if you want to host it online, if it's for a client thing, it's really, really, really important to know the rights behind whatever music you have. The YouTube music library is probably one of the best overall free resources out there. It's huge. They add stuff to it. You can use everything on there on YouTube, in monetized videos even. And the reason it works so well is because it does kind of aggregate a bunch of different free resources from across the internet. So it's not just like YouTube songs, but they find all the other sites I would normally recommend to go find free royalty-free music, because royalty-free music isn't always free. Free royalty-free music, the YouTube audio library is definitely the place to go for that, I think. If you want to move beyond that, that's where like Artlist and Epidemic come into play, and there's other stuff like Premium Beat, and there's all kinds of services out there. I like Artlist and Epidemic the best myself, and I like Epidemic because they have a big catalog, and I like Artlist because they have a more versatile license, although they're kind of adding in plans, but Artlist does still have their like universal license. It's still there. It's not like they're one and only that they used to be. So when it comes to licensing music, making sure that can be used the way it's intended is very important. And that's a little bit tricky if you're working with clients where you're giving them the project and then they might want to upload that to their own YouTube channel or something, for example. So whatever service you're using, wherever you're getting your music from, be sure that you know what the terms are and what the licensing agreement is, so that way you do things correctly. And if you are licensing music for a client project, don't be afraid to invoice them for that. Don't be afraid to include that, because you might even need to license it in their name, so that way they could upload it to their own channel or whatever, and it's not going to get claimed even though you had a license to the music. So that's a really important one there. Hassan, what's up, Hassan? When using multiple cameras for A-roll, what's your strategy on switching cameras and punching in while editing? I do have a video that covers this. I'll put a link in there. It's about how to use 2 cameras when filming. I know there's a controversy about using 2 cameras. Some people love it. Some people hate it. Some people think you should always be looking directly into the camera. Some people don't. I use 2 cameras a lot when I do A-roll, and I'm usually not looking into the second camera. The reason for that is I actually like that style. I got the idea from documentaries where there'd be a documentary, watch an interview with someone, then it cuts to kind of like a side shot where you sort of see them from a different angle, and you might even see a little bit of like the camera or the lights that they're talking to. I just like that, thought it looked cool, started doing it in my YouTube videos. But it's also a huge editing lifesaver. Anytime that I edit a video, I'm probably going to be cropping in a little bit. So if I just film with one camera while editing, I'll probably be punching in a little bit. And the reason I do that is to avoid jump cuts. We've evolved to a point where jump cuts they're not taboo like they used to be. But I like the creative challenge of not using them. So, if I need to cut out a mistake or a filler word in a clip, and then if I put those together, even if the audio flows smoothly, that jump is going to look a little bit strange. We've all seen it. We're all probably pretty used to it. I love the challenge of hiding those as much as possible. B-roll's a great way. You just put a B-roll clip over that seam where the 2 clips come together, and then it will be totally invisible. But that's also where you can switch camera angles. You can crop in a little bit. Usually I go from like 100% to maybe 140 or 150% with my specific shot that I use. And that's enough to like differentiate it so it almost looks like 2 different shots. I also really like that because what it means is even with only using one camera while filming A-roll, I've now already got 2 camera angles to cut between. So even if I added nothing else to the video, it can be at least a little bit dynamic because it's going to pop in and out. The third camera adds in, well, I guess it'd be the second camera adds in a third angle. And that just gives, by the time I'm just done doing the talking head, I've already now got 3 camera angles that I can cut between, which really makes things more dynamic, more interesting, and cover up mistakes, which is also why I don't look into the second camera personally. If I looked into the second camera, I would have to know what lines I'm delivering to which camera. If I'm not looking into the second camera, it makes it much easier to cut to that when I need to cover up a jump cut or because I've cut something out. And so the philosophy I have on how to use those is the regular main shot, the wide shot is usually like when I'm introducing a concept or a topic, the beginning of the video, the end of the video is usually there. So, here's the intro to the video. This is what we're talking about. And now when I want to emphasize a point, it doesn't even have to be because there's a jump cut. It just might be I want to emphasize this point that I'm saying. That's when I'll punch in to emphasize the point and then punch back out. I will also then, obviously I cut to B-roll when that's relevant. And then I like to cut back to that wide shot when I start with a new topic. So that's kind of like setting the stage. Punching in is to emphasize stuff. And it just sort of ends up working. That's oftentimes where jump cuts would be anyway. So it works pretty well together. And then the side angle, the angle from the second camera is sometimes it could be if I want to show something like, I move my hands around a lot or I might grab equipment or something and that shot just might show something from a different angle. It does help contextualize a little bit, like who am I, where am I, what am I doing? But I also like it when I've used the wide shot to introduce a point, I've punched in to emphasize a point, I've cut back to the wide shot to continue on that point, and now as I'm continuing to talk about that thing, now we've cut over to the second camera, to that side angle, just to sort of see. It's like as I'm continuing on in a point. So that's sort of like, I never use that to introduce a point or to emphasize a point. I use that kind of in the middle as we're continuing on to something. And then I make sure that I'm able to sit on that shot long enough that it makes sense. I've seen people use a second camera, but they cut to it. It's literally like half a second. It's almost like a Fight Club individual frame subliminal thing where I'm like, wait, did they just... what? It was too quick. Like they're too scared to use the second angle. So you want to make sure that you use it properly. Like definitely just go by what makes sense. One thing that I try to do though is whatever I'm going to be using in that video, and speaking generally, I introduce it within like the first 45 seconds of the video if possible. So if I'm going to be punching in, I want to punch in at least once in that first part of the video. If I'm going to use the side shot, I want to use that in the first 45 seconds because it can feel really weird if you're 6 minutes into a video and suddenly here's a weird other camera angle for no reason that we've never seen before. It can be a little jarring and confusing. So that's my thoughts on that. Let's see here. Ernesto Maldonado asks, best practices for making, keeping, and reusing the artwork you use in your videos, like lower thirds, transitions, etc. It's a great question. There are a bunch of ways that you can approach this. It kind of depends on your editing software. I know most editors, Final Cut, Premiere, Resolve, it's easy to make presets. So for me, a lot of stuff, like if I ever show a still image, like or even a picture-in-picture kind of thing, I usually put a blue border around it, and I just have that as a preset. So if I need a blue border, I can just drag that preset that I made, and it's going to put a blue outline in the correct shade of blue around that element, whatever it is. If I want to adjust colors a certain way, there's a preset for that. I even have a preset for cropping in, which I usually still have to adjust a little bit, but instead of having to like start from scratch every time, add on that preset, boom, now I've cropped in. So those elements are there. But other assets, like in my case, it would be like my logo, the little animated thing at the end that says subscribe. I just keep those in a folder on my computer's internal drive. The folder is creatively titled YouTube channel. And I just keep those things there. I also keep music there, like my outro song that I use in every video, stuff that I know, anything that I know I'm going to be needing regularly that can't live as a preset within the application just goes into that folder. So it's always just internally on the computer, readily available anytime I need it. It's also backed up on our server and stuff, of course, but it's always just on the internal drive, so it can be added to any project, no problem, and it also never gets moved. And that has worked really, really well for me, personally. Let's see here. Jared, what's up, Jared? What's the best way to do J and L cuts in Final Cut Pro? Right now, I'm just detaching the audio, sliding it over, and adjusting the start to end of the footage as needed. Is there an easier way? I'm really glad you asked this. The beauty of Final Cut is there's always something to learn, and I learned how to do this maybe like a year ago, which was like 10 years into me using Final Cut Pro. J and L cuts, we talked about those a little bit earlier, and the way to do those. The way Jared's doing them by just, if you have a video clip that has audio as part of it, you can right click on that clip and then detach the audio, and then you can essentially like trim away either the video part or the audio part, depending if you're doing a J or an L cut. The reason that they're called J and L cuts is just because if you look at them on the editing timeline, the way that the clips, depending on if you're doing like the audio first or the video first, the way that they're layered into the other footage either looks like a capital J or a capital L. So it's just like which direction are you working from. In Final Cut, there is a way to do this. It's very easy. You can double click on the audio waveform, not the line that's in the middle, but just the waveform itself. And it will then look like it detached the audio. You can do your J cut, L cuts the same way as if the audio were detached, but the audio is not detached. So you can even then double click it again and it'll like condense the clip back to where it was. And then you're good to go. I use that in every video. Just double click the waveform, pops up. It's super quick, super easy. And then you don't have extra clips of detached audio floating around. I really, really love that. Let's see here. Logan Webb, this continues on with Kane's question from earlier. What's your process on saving media and managing media? Do you dump your footage or archive it? This becomes, anytime you start editing video, media management becomes huge. So first and foremost, what I like to do anytime I start any project is make sure my camera's memory card is empty and formatted. I don't want any old stuff taking up space, confusing me, whatever, on the camera's memory card. So in order to do that, I need to make sure that all of the footage is taken care of. The way that I do it is when I go to edit a project, I create a folder for that project. It usually has the number of whatever it is. So video number 342, and then the title of the video. Put all the footage for that video in that folder. Currently, that folder then stays on my computer's desktop until I'm done with the project. In the past, I've kept that on an external SSD that I attached, but my MacBook Pro has 2 terabytes internally. That's more than enough space, so I just keep it internal so I don't have to attach a drive. If your computer doesn't have enough internal storage, you can just keep a folder like this on an external drive, and it works great. And then, so basically any of the footage that's like on my computer is usually very visible. It's right on the desktop in a folder. And anything that's hanging out on my computer is something I'm currently working on. So that doesn't move then until I'm done with that project. And then when I'm done with the project, it needs to get off the computer. So what I was doing for a long time, I just had some external hard drives and I was just archiving stuff to those, which is really the easiest and most cost-effective way to do it. So definitely recommend starting there. I was just starting to fill them up really quickly, especially after moving to 4K. And then I had one of them die. And I almost ended up losing so much footage, and that got me a little bit scared. So a little over a year ago, we got a NAS like RAID. It's a multi hard drive storage server thing that we have. And I hate networking stuff. I don't like it's such a nightmare to me. I had avoided getting this for so long. We got the Synology, I think it's the DS920. It has 4 bays. So we got 4 16 terabyte drives, which is 48 terabyte total. Wait, 16 is 30, 64 terabytes total. But one of them is only a backup drive. So the way that it's set up, which was surprisingly easier than I expected it to be, still a little confusing. You can set it up in a bunch of different ways. The way we have ours set up is there are 4 drives. One of them is only a backup drive. And I don't know exactly how this works because it can back up, that one drive can back up the 3 other drives. I don't know. It's a smart thing. So basically, if any of the drives does happen to fail, the stuff that's on it doesn't get lost. It's on this backup drive and can be restored into a new drive somehow. So the server itself is a great backup, but then within that, the way that it's set up, there's backup built into it, which is, it's worked really well so far. So that is now where Heather and I both store everything. So once I'm done working on something, I put that raw footage file, or the file with all the raw footage, in an archive folder on the server, and then I have another folder that's all the finished videos themselves. So I can go into this one folder and it's just every fully edited finished video, go into another folder, and it's just full of other folders that have the project files in them. I don't really ever save the actual Final Cut projects. I delete my library every month. I have a video all about that too, but Final Cut libraries and stuff are sort of strange. I usually use one library per month and then do different events and projects within that library, unless it's something that's not my own. So like right now, I have my January or my February library, because I'm definitely not recording this in January and releasing it in February. I have my February library, and then I also have another library that's for a client project I'm working on. So those are my two libraries. But as soon as the month is over, then I delete that library, start a new one, just to keep things from getting weird, because libraries get weird as time goes on, just like they do in the real world. And the trickier thing too is, for a long time I was keeping all of my talking head clips, which wasn't an issue until I started using 4K for everything when I got my Sony cameras, because then I ended up with, a 40 to 60 minute 4K clip of me just talking. And then I started using two cameras, and I have two of those. So that could end up being 30 to 40 gigabytes of just me talking times two clips. And I have 80 gigs that's just me talking, which I will never need again. So I no longer save the talking head stuff. I went through the server and deleted all the old ones. I just save the non-talking head clips, the B-roll clips, anything special. If it's something strange, like if there were a talking head thing and it was like, I had someone with me, or there was something unique or special about it, I would probably keep that. But for the most part, I don't keep the talking heads anymore. That cleared up so much room on the server. It's crazy. And I've never needed to do anything like by the time I delete the footage, I guess this is important. By the time I move the footage off and delete it from the computer and delete the project, I've already proofed it. It's already done. If it's going up on YouTube, not only have I already watched it on my computer, I've uploaded it to YouTube and rewatched it from start to finish there to make sure nothing weird happened when it got uploaded. And at that point, I know the file is totally fine. I'm deleting this project, moving the footage, deleting it off of my computer. That's really important. Same thing with a client type project. Make sure they have it, make sure they're good with it. They're done. We're over. Now I can delete that. Client projects are the times where I will save maybe like a library or a timeline for a longer period of time, just in case, and then go back after a few months or whatever it might be to just delete it. So it's a little different when you're working on something for somebody else. If you're working on something for yourself, then you can just make all of the rules, of course. But that's how I handle archiving footage. It's a very important thing. Having the archive of B-roll footage is amazing now, especially on the server where I can just access it, everything from anywhere all the time. It's like, wait, I need this one shot of the Sony FX3's sensor shining in the light. Well, instead of having to go set everything up, I know I have 5 of those shots. I'll just go grab one. Oh, it's amazing. Definitely recommend that. Last question, certainly last but not least. Wait, no. Last but certainly not least is from India Delgado. India is the one who is the reason I bought this Lewitt LCT 240. India was doing a stream like 2 years ago now, and she's still using the LCT 240, and she just sounded so good. And the mic looked so cool that while watching the stream, I remember I was like ordering the microphone right now. So India's the one who got me hooked on the LCT 240. And India asks, do you edit on the go or when lounging around using your iPad or just your MacBook? If you do use the iPad, what app do you use? I've been using LumaFusion, but about to learn DaVinci to use that. Super great question. So to answer your question, MacBook. I don't really do any editing on the iPad. I use my iPad for Procreate to do some of the graphics and stuff, but none of the editing. I have used LumaFusion, and it's amazing, and I love LumaFusion for when I was teaching, because I was able to put it on our class iPads and students could check it out. And LumaFusion is a really powerful application. It to me, in terms of iPad editing, it's the way to go. The iPad also comes with iMovie, of course, which is great, and it's free with the iPad, but it only costs an iPad, and then you get iMovie. But LumaFusion, it's like $20 or something. Super worth it. Resolve coming to the iPad before Final Cut Pro, which is very interesting. I haven't used that. I think that's really cool. I think it's almost like they're letting Blackmagic be the guinea pigs before they try to do anything with Final Cut on the iPad. I haven't used it myself. From what I've heard, it's neat and it's good for basic stuff, but it's not for finishing and diving in real deep in depth. So I can't really speak to that. I have used LumaFusion. I even have a video all about LumaFusion that was edited. The whole thing was just made on an iPad, thumbnail and all. And that was from a couple of years ago. So LumaFusion's only gotten better since then. But I do love using the MacBook Pro. That's why I like the MacBook. It's going to be hard. I can't imagine having a desktop as my main editing computer again, even though I'd want like, it'd be cool to have one of those really nice blue iMacs. Those are awesome. I guess the specs inside are good too, but the color is cool. But the MacBook is amazing because I can hook it up at my desk to an external monitor and then edit from there, but then I can take it. So yeah, that's what I use. I love to, edit not in my office, edit in the kitchen, edit outside. If I'm going on a trip, obviously editing is fun. The first time I ever got to edit on an airplane, like, I don't know, it must have been like 6 or 7 months after starting my YouTube channel. I was traveling somewhere and I was editing a video on a plane. I was like, this is the coolest thing in the world. Like, wow, I've never gotten to do anything like this before. So the MacBook Pro for me is the best. That's why I love the 14-inch MacBook. I've had 15 and 16-inch MacBooks in the past, and they're amazing to use because the screen is so nice. They are a nightmare to travel with because they're just way too big. They don't fit in bags. They're just, the 13 and 14-inch MacBook Pros are just like the perfect size and so easy to use. You get a little cramped on the screen sometimes, but that's what I use, and that's what I tell yous. Wow, we did 91 minutes. So that was, hope there was a lot of interesting stuff there about editing. Obviously, we could go on forever talking about editing, and there's so much that I didn't touch on, but I'm hoping that for anybody who is wanting to start editing or is kind of looking to brush up some of their skills, I hope this was helpful and interesting, and you're able to kind of like cherry pick some info that will be useful in the future. If you've got anything you want to add, feel free to send it in. You can always go to HiMyNameIsTom.com and leave a voice message right there. You don't need any extra equipment. Just click a button, record using whatever device you're on, and you can do that right there. Or you can email me, tom@enthusiasmproject.com. And if you're like, man, I really want to edit now, I wish I had someone to teach me, you can go to learnfinalcutpro.com and check out Rough Cut to Final Cut, which is my video editing course that I'm super proud of and I really love, and it's a ton of fun. And there's some new fun updates coming in the not too distant future. So that is our show this week. Thank you so much for listening. I would love to know what you think, and I hope you have a safe, happy, healthy, fun rest of your week, and I will see you next time.